The Seleucid Empire was one of the preeminent powers of the Eastern Mediterranean in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, with its territories at various points stretching from Europe to India. While it is not as well known today as the Empire of Alexander which preceded it, and the Roman and Parthian empires which would succeed it, the story of its rise and fall is a highly interesting one. Its history presents a tale filled with political intrigue and murder, with familial betrayal and vengeful lovers, and with great clashes of arms between mighty empires. In this series we'll be charting the course of the empire, starting with its founder, Seleucus I Nicator, and ultimately ending in ignominy some 3 centuries later with a smattering of Roman puppet kings. Seleucus I Nicator was one of the officers of Alexander the Great who rose to prominence in the years after the conqueror's untimely death. He possessed an incredible knack for survival, while all of his contemporaries died through the constant wars and power struggles that followed Alexander's passing. As a result, Seleucus rose from a soldier to be the Lord of Asia, and to establish one of the greatest empires of the ancient world. However, because of his status as the founder of a kingdom, much of his life is coloured by myths and legends, portents and prophecies of his greatness to come. Some of this is surely mere propaganda put out by Seleucus himself, but equally some of it was likely told in reverent tones by the later citizens of the empire that would follow him, much in the same way the Romans told stories of Romulus and Remus being suckled by a she-wolf, or the way Americans tell the story of George Washington being unable to lie after taking an axe to his father's cherry tree. After all, every civilization likes to think that theirs is ordained to be by the cosmos. Given this, throughout this account there are many seemingly improbable and mystical events that take place. These stories are oft overlooked in modern accounts due to their probable ahistorical nature, but they are interesting stories, and were intrinsic to how the life of Seleucus was understood by the ancients, so they will be retold here. Nevertheless, take those parts of Seleucus' life with a healthy grain of salt. Additionally, the surviving sources for this part of the world, after the death of Alexander and prior to the Roman Empire, are not many in number, are often contradictory or unclear, and almost all were written quite a while after the events described. An effort has been made to lay things out in a way which is both comprehensible and enjoyable, without getting too bogged down in the historiography. Now, with the disclaimers out of the way, let us begin with the story of Seleucus. Seleucus was born either in 358, 356, or 354 BC, depending which source is consulted, making him of the same generation, and perhaps the very same age, as Alexander III the Great of Macedon. His birthplace was the town of Europus, in the kingdom of Macedon, which lay just north of the royal residence at Pella. His father, Antiochus, and his mother, Laodice, were members of the Macedonian aristocracy, with Antiochus having served as an officer under King Philip II, the one-eyed king who had brought most of Greece under Macedonian rule. As such, Seleucus was most probably a page in the royal court at Pella, as many young men of the aristocracy were, where he would have been trained in arms and horsemanship, as well as more academic subjects, with instructors like Aristotle, so as to be effective officers in the royal army. Coming out of such an apprenticeship, he was inducted into the Companions, the elite shock cavalry and royal bodyguards, who were led in battle personally by Alexander. King Philip during his reign had revolutionised the Macedonian army. Rather than the traditional 6 to 10 foot dory spear, the infantry instead carried 18-foot sarissa pikes, granting greater reach. Rather than carrying a large hoplon in their offhand, they instead had a smaller telamon shield slung over their shoulder, allowing them to dedicate both hands to their weapon. And rather than a panoply of armour, they usually only wore a helmet, allowing a phalangite to move with greater speed than a hoplite, and being cheaper to equip. These soldiers, able to move faster and engage at greater distance than a hoplite phalanx, would pin down and press the enemy, while the companions and the other cavalry rode around the flanks and slammed into the rear of the enemy force, breaking the foe on the anvil of the pike phalanx. This would prove to be the most potent method of warfare in the Mediterranean until the introduction of the Roman manipula system. Once King Philip was assassinated in 336 BC, most of the Macedonian Empire rose in revolt. Alexander, now king, set out to put down the uprisings, starting with the Greek city-states, and Seleucus would have joined him on campaign. The king mustered his cavalry and raced south from Pella, travelling with such speed the Greek cities were taken by complete surprise and ended their revolt without a battle. His southern flank secured, in 335 BC he campaigned east into Thrace, and then north all the way to the Danube, before heading to the west and subjugating the Illyrians. While Alexander was gone, a rumour was spread in Greece that he had died, which led the cities of Thebes and Athens to once again revolt. Again, he moved south with ferocious speed, with the Thebans waking up to unexpectedly see the Macedonian army outside their walls. After the ensuing battle, the city was razed to the ground, the men slaughtered, and the women and children enslaved. Upon hearing this, the rest of Greece once again submitted to Macedon. Now that his territory was secured, Alexander embarked on his great campaign into the east, crossing into Asia Minor and invading the Achaemenid Empire in 334 BC. Before Seleucus left with the army, his mother Laodice was said to have confronted him and told him the truth of his heritage. His father was not Antiochus at all, but the god Apollo. He had come to Laodice one night in a dream and conceived a child with her, giving her a ring marked with the symbol of an anchor. When she awoke the next morning, she was pregnant, and the engraved ring from her dream was found in her bed. When Seleucus was born, he had a matching birthmark of an anchor on his thigh. Having told her son the truth of his divine origin, she entrusted the ring to him and sent him on his way. The anchor engraved on the ring would become Seleucus's personal sigil, and it was also said that wherever Seleucus would lose this ring is where he would reign over as king. In Asia, the campaign against the Persians went remarkably well, with Alexander having won at Granicus and at Issus, and having secured the whole west of the empire by 331 BC. During this time, Seleucus consulted the Didymaean oracle to ask whether he should now leave the army and return home to Macedon. The oracle greeted him as King Seleucus, and then told him, "Do not hurry back to Europe. Asia will be much better for you." Staying with the army, and heading further east, they reached the river Euphrates, into the waters of which Seleucus lost his divine ring. Alexander engaged the Persian Emperor Darius one last time at Gaugamela, winning decisively and breaking effective Persian resistance once and for all. After consolidating the east and the north of his new empire in 327 BC, Alexander then began his campaign to the Indian subcontinent, marching through the Khyber Pass. After receiving the loyalty of a local king, the army came to the river Hydaspes, today called the Jhelum, in the Punjab, where another Indian ruler, King Porus, was waiting to do battle. By this time, Seleucus had risen through the ranks, and was appointed to lead the shield bearers, the most elite infantry of the Macedonian army, in the coming battle. The battle was a bloody affair, with Alexander almost dying, and Seleucus coming face to face with the might of Indian elephants, something he would not soon forget. Victory was gained, and another kingdom was subjugated, but after this the Macedonian soldiers were exhausted, and refused to go any further east, despite the exhortation of their king. So the army turned back and returned to Susa in Persia by 324 BC. There, Alexander married as many as 100 of his Macedonian officers to Persian noblewomen, in an effort to force a merger of the two cultures. As part of this mass wedding, Seleucus was married to a Sogdian princess named Apama, who he seems to have genuinely loved, as she would later bear him 3 children, and he would in turn name 3 cities after her. Their firstborn, a boy named Antiochus, came soon after the marriage. It is often stated that upon the later death of Alexander, every Macedonian officer divorced his Persian wife, with the sole exception of Seleucus. However, there is no hard evidence for this being the case. Rather, this has been supposed by modern scholars due to the lack of further historical record for any of the Persian brides except Apama. Given the Macedonian tradition of polygyny, it is not unreasonable to think that many of the officers did in fact keep their new wives, in addition to more prominent Hellenic brides. In any case, Apama is by far the most notable and important of the brides of Susa. Another event foretelling Seleucus' destiny came around this time, when he and Alexander were sailing in the lagoons around Babylon. A great gust of wind came and blew Alexander's crown off his head, and it landed in reeds which were growing off the tomb of some ancient and forgotten king. Seleucus dove into the water and swam to it, placing the diadem on his own head as he swam back, so as to avoid wetting it. This was said to portend the death of Alexander and the subsequent rise of Seleucus. Another time, a wild bull was brought forward to be sacrificed to Alexander, who by this time demanded the treatment worthy of a god-king. But the great bovine broke loose from his restraints, and Seleucus, with his impressive strength, wrestled it to the ground. It is reported that this is why Seleucus was sometimes artistically depicted with horns. Of course, this is rather convenient, as Alexander himself was depicted with horns, as that was the symbol of Zeus Ammon, who Alexander believed to be his divine father. Other rulers who followed Alexander would also incorporate this feature into their public art and coinage. Alexander later attended a feast held by Medius of Larissa, from whence he was carried away in great pain. It has long been suggested this was some sort of deliberate poisoning conducted by some of Alexander's officers, and some versions of the story from the later Alexander romance state that Seleucus was in attendance, but this is very far from a reliable account. Arrian, in his account, is certainly skeptical of the stories of poisoning, as are many modern scholars. In any case, Alexander was deathly ill. He grew weaker and weaker, and eventually lost the ability to speak altogether. On seeing this, a group of his officers, including Seleucus, spent a night in the temple of Serapis, a god of healing. They awaited a vision, wishing to know whether it would help heal their king if they brought him into the temple. Eventually a divine response came to the gathered men, that it was right for Alexander to remain where he was. He died shortly thereafter, at the age of 32, and in 323 BC, his great empire began to fall into disarray. Perdiccas, who was by then commander of the companions, had been given by the dying Alexander his signet ring, and using this as justification seized control of the army and declared himself regent. For Alexander left no clear heir, only a mentally unfit half-brother, Aridaeus, a pregnant Persian wife, and an illegitimate son, Heracles. There was much disagreement between the officers and the soldiers of the Macedonian army as to who should be the next king, and different factions formed. One general, Meleager, who was in favour of Aridaeus, took command of the infantry of the army and placed himself in opposition to Perdiccas. Perdiccas believed they should wait until Alexander's wife Roxana had given birth to see if it was a boy, while Meleager opposed the idea of having a half-Persian ruler. The two sides nearly came to blows, but Perdiccas managed to convince the infantry that it was wrong that Macedonians should kill other Macedonians. It was then agreed the empire should be ruled by Aridaeus, but if Roxana had a son, he should also be made king. No side appeared to be interested in the claim of Heracles. Aridaeus took the regnal name Philip III and was married to his niece Eurydice. Shortly after, under the pretense of a military review, Perdiccas had the ringleaders of the faction who had opposed him seized and executed, including Meleager. This put fear into his enemies, but also gave rise to suspicion and hatred against him, hatred which would only grow. So much for the supposed evils of kinslaying. Thereafter the empire was divided up among the generals of Alexander, each given different roles and satrapies, with Perdiccas as regent over them all. Seleucus was appointed now as commander of the companions. Roxana soon gave birth to a son, named Alexander for his father, who was proclaimed as king, although he would only ever be a figurehead. Perdiccas and Seleucus took their army on campaign in Cappadocia, where the former Persian satrap there, Ariarathes, refused to stand aside for the appointed governor, Eumenes, who had been Alexander's private secretary, but also was, notably, a Scythian or a Thracian by birth, rather than a Greek of any kind. Ariarathes was defeated handily. He and many of his relatives were tortured and crucified, and Eumenes was placed in charge. Meanwhile, tensions brewed between the new satraps of the empire, called the Diadochi, the successors. Perdiccas began to court Cleopatra, the sister of Alexander, a potential marriage between the two being seen as an attempt to legitimize any claim Perdiccas may have made on supreme power. When this was discovered, a faction formed against Perdiccas, made up of Antipater and Craterus, who together governed Greece and Macedon, Antigonus, satrap of Greater Phrygia, Menander, satrap of Lydia, Asander, satrap of Caria, and Ptolemy, satrap of Egypt. The inciting incident between these two factions was the capture of Alexander's body by Ptolemy in 321 BC. It had been en route to Macedon, so that Alexander may be buried in his homeland, at the royal tombs at Aigai, when Ptolemy seized it and conveyed it instead to Memphis in Egypt, so that his domain should have the honour of housing the conqueror's corpse. Perdiccas would not stand for this, and assembled his army to march into Egypt and depose Ptolemy, with his intention thereafter to cross the Hellespont and invade Macedonia itself. Meanwhile, Eumenes was given troops with which to protect Asia Minor from any incursion in the other direction. Neoptolemus, a general ostensibly under Eumenes, had been in contact with Antipater and Craterus, and refused to join his forces with those of Eumenes. Battle was made, and Neoptolemus was roundly defeated, but he escaped and fled to Craterus, who he persuaded to attack Eumenes. Their armies met near the Hellespont, and Craterus personally led the charge. But after the battle was joined, his horse lost its footing, and the general was trampled to death. Meanwhile, Eumenes and Neoptolemus personally met on the right flank of the battle. They managed to grapple each other while on horseback, and falling from their horses, took to wrestling on the ground, trying to tear off each other's armour. The fighting between the men went back and forth, with both being wounded, until eventually Eumenes managed to stab Neoptolemus in the neck and slay him. With their leaders dead, the rebel army broke and fled, the survivors eventually joining Antipater. Meanwhile, Perdiccas was continuing his advance towards Egypt. However, his men grew less and less enamoured with their leader due to his overbearing nature, his egotism, and his refusal to hear the counsel of others. On the other hand, due to their prior service alongside him, Perdiccas' officers knew Ptolemy to be a clement and wise man who encouraged his officers to speak frankly. And so Perdiccas' officers began to desert him. Coming to the east bank of the Nile, Perdiccas besieged a fortress held by Ptolemy, but was repulsed, with Ptolemy personally leading the defence, spear in hand. Abandoning the siege, Perdiccas marched south to Memphis and attempted to ford the river there, but failed, with a great many men drowning in the attempt. At this point his soldiers had had enough, and began a mutiny. Perdiccas' senior officers, Python, Antigenes, and Seleucus, came upon him in his tent and murdered him. The news of the great victory of Eumenes only arrived 2 days after the death of Perdiccas. Had it arrived earlier, the boost to the morale of the men may have stayed their hands and saved the region's life. Ptolemy, hearing of the assassination, came to Perdiccas' camp, made peace with his men, and offered them supplies. Ptolemy nominated Python as one of Perdiccas' officers, and one of his own officers, called Aridaeus, to act as co-regents. After this, in 320 BC, the senior officers of the empire met at Triparadisus, modern Baalbek in Lebanon, where a conference was to be held. While they were awaiting the arrival of all of the officers, the authority of the new co-regents was undermined by Queen Eurydice, who was likely seeking more autonomy for her husband, and thus more power for herself. She obstructed the regents, and countermanded their orders, with increasingly more people listening to her and not to the regents. Thus the regents decided to resign. Once the conference began, Antipater was elected to replace them as the new regent of the empire. Though, not without objection, Queen Eurydice gave a public oration condemning Antipater, and riled up a mob against him, likely including some of his own soldiers, who were aggrieved at having not yet been paid for their role in the war against Perdiccas. Antipater fled the angry throng back to his camp, while Seleucus and Antigonus tried, very unsuccessfully, to calm the crowd. He returned shortly thereafter with his cavalry, and ended the disturbance by force. Eurydice's gambit had failed, and Antipater was thus confirmed in his new position. Then the satrapies and the officers of the empire were once again divided up. Most relevant for our purposes, Seleucus was made the satrap of Babylon, and his old position as the head of the companions was awarded to Cassander, the son of Antipater. While Babylon was a very prosperous and significant city in the empire, serving as a de facto capital for Alexander, it was of no major military value, and was far from Antipater's seat of power in Greece, but not so far that events there could not be observed. It also lacked a large Macedonian settler population, from which soldiers could be drawn. It is relevant to note that Macedonian troops were preferred by all of the Diadochi, as they were skilled professional soldiers, and the experience of Alexander's campaigns had not given a glowing recommendation to the quality of local infantrymen. These men were often supplemented with mercenaries, recruited from elsewhere in the Greek world, even as far as southern Italy. Local Easterners were mostly only recruited for use as cavalry and missile troops, at least at this point in time. Indeed, Ptolemy would make it a strict policy not to train and arm local Egyptians, in case they rose up against him. Now, even though Seleucus had betrayed and killed Perdiccas, he had still been one of the chief officers of the old regent, so it was best he was put somewhere out of the way where he could pose no threat to the new order, but also where he would be comfortable and not inclined to revolt. Babylon was perfect. Seleucus packed his bags and headed east to take up his new appointment. It is possible that upon his arrival, Seleucus had to wage a battle against Decimus, who had been sent by Perdiccas to take the city, but no record of any battle exists, and it is entirely possible that by this point, having heard of the defeat of Perdiccas, Decimus had left to join his forces with those of the remaining Perdican loyalists. For the next time we hear of him, he is fighting in Asia Minor. Thus Seleucus slipped into comfortable retirement as the governor of Babylon. The last act of the council was to declare Eumenes an enemy of the state, and Antigonus was assigned the task of hunting him down. In the summer of 319 BC, their forces met at Orcynia in Cappadocia, and due to the treachery of one of Eumenes' commanders, a certain Apollonides, a large contingent of the army deserted in the middle of the battle, leaving Eumenes defeated and 8,000 of his men slain. Eumenes escaped and fled to the fortress of Nora, which Antigonus besieged. After a failed attempt at negotiation, Antigonus put one of his subordinates in command of the siege, and went to deal with the remaining Perdicans, including Decimus, who he decisively defeated near the town of Critopolis, leaving Eumenes' fortress as all that was left supporting the Perdican cause, the subjugation of which would end the civil war, and leave the empire in peace. Next time, we will find out whether Antigonus can finish off Eumenes, whether the empire can maintain its peace, and whether Seleucus will remain in retirement. If you have any comments, criticism, or questions, please post them below, and thank you for listening.